Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for being on. I've had many different folks on the show over the years, politicians and celebrities, but I've never had a high-ranking military officer before. So thank you very much for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
I did obviously want to talk about the war in Ukraine and get your insight on that. But for folks out there who may not be familiar with you and your background, could you just maybe give a quick run over of your resume?
I spent 31 years in the United States Army as an enlisted man and an officer, 2 as an enlisted man and 29 as an officer. And the last 12 years I spent with all the services as we became more and more joint, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. And the last 12 years I spent at the highest level of power, if you will, in both the U.S. government and certainly in the military, because I was special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the late General Colin Powell, from 1989 to 1993. Then I ran the Marine Corps War College until 97. Then I worked for Powell in a private capacity after I retired from the military for 3 years. And then he asked me to come to the State Department with him in 2000, and we essentially put me in the policy planning staff under Ambassador Richard Haas for a year, and then I became his chief of staff until January 2005 when we both departed the State Department.
So again, I really wanted to get your insight on the war that has been unfolding in Ukraine over the past month. So I guess the first question I have for you is, were you as surprised as some other commentators were that Russia did invade? Because I know there were many folks who were skeptical of the idea that Russia would actually invade Ukraine. Did that surprise you as well?
A full-scale invasion, which I still hesitate to call it because he's been very circumspect, or his military has been very circumspect at this point, despite the salivating U.S. media, mainstream media in particular. He's been fairly calm about what he's doing. He's not, for example, ranging over the fields. He knows Ukraine and Russia provide 50%, for example, of the grain and barley and corn and wheat to Lebanon and to the Middle East and North Africa. He doesn't want to destroy that breadbasket. And he's doing some other things too. But I didn't think he would do it to the scale he's doing. Up to this point, Putin has been a chess master strategist. He's played us, in particular, like a Stradivarius in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Georgia. He's really used our strategic errors to at least poke us in the eye, if not actually defeat us in a certain way. Libya is a basket case right now, and NATO led that operation. So, I mean, Putin is picking up some of the pieces, as he is in other places. So it rather surprised me that he's being a little bit more, if not a lot more, toward the sort of insanity side of the scale, if you will, in Ukraine, since he's been so good up to this point at making sure he doesn't risk much and that he wins a good bit. And then the third thing I would point out is the history of this. And the history of this is just reprehensible. I could tell you that Putin would invade Ukraine or do something, and I thought it would be less than an invasion. I thought he'd take the eastern part and then quit like he did in Georgia. I could have told you that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, certainly, and 2 years ago, absolutely, because of our mistakes. Expanding NATO to 30 countries was a tragic mistake, and we're paying for that now. Now, let's count who's paying. The average citizen is paying in raised gas prices and so forth, and the average Ukrainian is paying with blood and money and their feet, as 3 million now have left Ukraine. But the contractors aren't paying. The military contractors are making a fortune off this war. Look at Lockheed, Raytheon, and others' share price right now. Look at what happened to it when the war started. This is how they make money. And also, the oil industry is making huge amounts of money, windfall profits off of this. We could see $200, $300 a barrel for oil here before it's over with. So there are people who are profiting off of this. Don't.
And I believe U.S. natural gas as well, because I believe we just signed a deal with the EU to supply them with natural gas.
And we just opened up again to that great enemy we, a few years ago, were trying to overthrow in a coup d'etat, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. We're going to help him get his oil back.
Well, since you brought up history, I really would like to get your insight there as well, because I grew up in the 90s. So my earliest memories of Russia were Bill Clinton palling around with Boris Yeltsin. And, through the 2000s, we saw George W. Bush and the Obama administration, seemingly having a somewhat friendly relationship with Russia. In the 2012 elections, I'm sure you recall, Barack Obama called out Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was our number one geopolitical foe. This is actually something that many different Democrats commented on at the time and laughed at Mitt Romney about. And since Obama's second term, we seem to have returned to the Cold War. So I'm just curious on your insight on this. How and why did this happen? Why did we become adversaries with Russia again over the past decade?
In 1989 and 90 and 91, I can say honestly and straightforwardly that Powell, H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, his Secretary of State, were all ecstatic. Powell in particular was ecstatic because he knew we were going to pay the American people a peace dividend back. He thought the defense budget was way too high. And we did. We cut the forces by about 25% because of the end of the Cold War. But he was more euphoric over what it meant for Russia. And he began to meet with Russian leaders, Warsaw Pact leaders and Russian leaders. And he began to tell them how to reshape and refashion their military and how to be the kind of professional force that they should be, smaller, cost less money, and so forth. And he was always expecting that eventually Russia, and I think the generals thought this way too in Russia, Russia would be a partner in NATO, that they would start out as an observer to the political and the military alliance, and then they would become members. This was the aspiration. This went right along through Bill Clinton's second Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry. Bill was the guy in the Pentagon who entertained my seminars at the Marine Corps War College for hours on end. We would talk with him. And he would go to Russia, come back, give us a seminar, and tell us about everything that was happening, from destroying their nuclear weapons. We were helping them do that, to teaching them things about how to run their military better. These were very, very high times for the relationship. Then all of a sudden, Bill Clinton decided his second term that he needed to do something in the Balkans, and he needed to do something to assert his foreign policy and security policy bona fides with the American people, or he might not get reelected. Remember, in November of that year, Colin Powell finally came out of the race. And Colin Powell would have shellacked Bill Clinton if he'd run. So Clinton was looking at ways to assert his military credentials, if you will, and he had zero. So he had to do something. So the first thing he did was enter the Balkans big time. And then for 78 days, he bombed the bejesus out of Belgrade and the Serbs in order to free Kosovo. This was a direct shot at Putin because that's Slavic country. And Putin has not forgotten it. If you look at some of his speeches, Russia has not recognized Kosovo as an independent entity, as we have not recognized Crimea. And therein lies a tale for diplomacy, if you will. But the situation just got worse and worse. There were some bright spots in there, as you pointed out, with Obama's first term. And there were some bright spots even with Putin. But it turned sour, and it went sour really fast after Georgia, I think, and my president going to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and standing beside that young president who incidentally went over to Odessa and became mayor of Odessa when they kicked him out of Georgia, and said Georgia would be a member of NATO. And you may recall Putin reacted immediately, invaded the two northern parts of Georgia and took them. Didn't blame him a bit. That was his prerogative because that was interference with his CSTO, his equivalent to NATO, just as Ukraine is, and just as much of this rest of expansion of NATO is. So while I can see Putin as a cynical dictator, even an evil person, he seems to want to kill people with, in nefarious means like dioxin poisoning or nuclear pellets or whatever. I still understand what he's doing. Because if Mexico were doing this to us, or Canada were doing this to us, we would be reacting the same way Putin's reacting. Just think about the Monroe Doctrine for a moment. The Monroe Doctrine is a statement of Putin's policy with regard to what NATO's doing. But we made the Monroe Doctrine, so it's good. Putin's CSTO is bad. So the history of this is, in my mind, from the very beginning, I saw it just go completely off the tracks. And it went off the tracks for the reasons of a president who wanted to reestablish or establish at all his bona fides in security policy, Bill Clinton, and a series of presidents who wanted to get the money for their political action committees and their campaigns and so forth out of defense contractors who will pay through the nose when they know they're going to get someone who will get them wars. And that's what they did. And the defense contractors influence the Congress in a significant way too, especially the armed services and appropriations committees. And so now we have this not just a revolving door with military officers going into the defense contracting business, but we have this revolving door all around, which takes everything and puts it to war, reaps the profits of war, finds another war, puts everything to that war, reaps the profits from that war. We have been at war in this country, constitutionally at war for 22 years.
Well, in regards to Ukraine specifically, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the U.S.'s involvement in the Maidan movement and what happened in 2013, 2014, because at the end of 2013, during the Maidan movement, you had two senators, a Republican and Democrat, attend the Maidan movement and speak to the crowds there. John McCain actually said to the crowd there that Kiev was the doorway to Russia.
People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
Народи українські, це ваш момент.
This is about you, no one else.
Це про вас.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Це про ваше майбутнє, про майбутнє вашої країни. Це про майбутнє, на яке ви заслуговуєте.
A future in Europe.
Майбутнє Європи.
A future of peace and good
Майбутнє
relations
миру.
with all of your neighbors.
Майбутнє всіх ваших сусідів.
The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you. And the destiny you seek lies in Europe.
І ваша доля, як ми вважаємо, знаходиться в об'єднаній Європі.
Ukraine will make Europe better, and Europe will make Ukraine better.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then obviously you had the infamous words of Victoria Nuland. John Brennan had traveled to Ukraine in 2014. So could you just speak to what the U.S.'s involvement was in 2014? Do you see that as the U.S. participating in a coup?
I do. And I think it started well before 2014. It started even before the Minsk agreement and before the real beginning of a conflict in eastern Ukraine brought on by essentially forces in Ukraine that weren't going to listen even to Kyiv. And a lot of those were neo-Nazis. And they were going to fight tooth and nail against anybody that they thought was not on their sheet of music. And Russians weren't, whether they were ethnic Russians who were citizens of Ukraine, the two easternmost oblasts, or whether they were Russians on the other side of the border. And they did. And so what did the Russians do? What would you do if you were in Texas and Mexico was sending across people to fight you? You'd fight them back. So that war, such as it was, low intensity conflict, had been going on for some time before the events you just talked about, which we entered big time with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is now partially a front for the CIA, the IRI, which is also a front for the CIA. CIA does not operate like it used to in covert operations unless you just take the general pattern. But you got to put the general pattern now in NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They use them. They infiltrate them and they use them. And these color revolutions that we've talked about from Caracas to Kyiv are a product of these people, quote, teaching democracy, unquote, to these people that they want to overthrow. And that's what we started doing. And the 2014 coup was a result of that. Finally, we had tried against Hugo Chavez in 2002. I was there when we did that in the government. We tried again against Nicolas Maduro. We were so incompetent. We failed both times miserably and hurt a lot of Venezuelans' lives and Colombians' lives who had to accept Venezuelan refugees and so forth. So yeah, this has been going on in Ukraine just as it has gone on in Syria, Somalia, Libya, and a host of other places around the world. And incidentally, let me point out that when the New York Times stated so categorically and gloriously that Putin had invaded another country, violated international law, and crossed the border, that's exactly what Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, said we did in 2003 in Iraq. And by the way, in 9 different countries right now, and over the past few years, we are flying drones across people's borders and in some instances killing people inside those borders without any constitutional authority, without that state's permission. So what is the hypocrisy of Washington today but about Mount Everest high?
Yeah, I mean, the media in particular, it's just so shameful how they report on this. They don't question any of the information that they're getting from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from the Biden administration. They're not comparing this to anything that the US has ever done before. I don't know if you saw the press conference that Biden gave at the NATO summit, where there was one reporter who was asking him if he had dismissed the possibility of World War III too quickly, which was just absolutely insane.
Cecilia, ABC. There you are.
Oh, absolutely, that way. Thank you. Sir, you've made it very clear in this conflict that you do not want to see World War III. But is it possible that in expressing that so early that you were too quick to rule out direct military intervention in this war? Could Putin have been emboldened knowing that you are not going to get involved directly in this conflict?
No and no.
You do not believe that?
One thing I do have to, I think, give the Biden administration credit for, I'd be very critical of them for many different reasons, but it seems as though Joe Biden has been pretty consistent in the fact that the U.S. is not going to be committing ground troops to Ukraine, that we're not going to be instituting a no-fly zone because that would result in World War III. Do you think, that's one kind of, bright side of this or silver lining that we can say, the Biden administration seems to be wanting to avoid World War III?
I do. In fact, I'm very happy that, pleased, ecstatic that Joe Biden is there. Joe Biden's been around for 29 years or more in the security policy, foreign policy business. I worked with Joe Biden when Powell would work with him when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, even more so than I worked with the Republican Dick Lugar when he was chairman, because we knew Biden knew the issues. And Biden knows one issue very well: nuclear weapons. And he came up, as I did, in the Cold War. I'm astonished today at how many people who didn't come up in that Cold War don't understand that nuclear weapons are not battlefield utility weapons. We even have some generals now in the Army in particular, but in the Air Force too, who think that they can use small yield nuclear weapons and not start some escalatory process. I got news for them. They should go back and dip into the archives and see what happened when we talked about this before. But a lot of leaders now in Europe and elsewhere weren't born in this period or didn't grow up in this period, didn't study this period, so they don't know it. But Joe did. Biden did. And that is his saving grace as far as I'm concerned right now. He's fighting off people like Blinken and Sullivan and others who want to do things. And Lloyd Austin at the Defense Department made a very powerful statement about a no-fly zone. And I was happy to hear that too. Now, I don't know whether he's just reacting to Biden or that's his integral military professional opinion. I suspect it's the latter, because he's old enough too to know you just don't go out and start shooting nuclear weapons.
At the same time, however, Biden did seem to have some less than above board dealings with Ukraine. That he actually stated this at one conference that he was at, where they pretty much intimidated the Ukrainian government to fire a prosecutor.
And I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. and they put in place someone who was solid.
It's been pretty rough. As you mentioned earlier, we engineered the leadership in Kiev. And more than just the top of that leadership, we engineered some of the leadership that's sucking the blood out of Ukraine the most. Because it is one of the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth. It was the fourth largest arms dealer before it had to start selling its arms to itself. But it ranked right there with Russia, the US, as arms merchants.
And, you know, that kind of segues good into something else I wanted to ask you about was the Russian claim of these biolabs across Ukraine that they came across. The U.S. is dismissing this as, you know, these are well known about, these were harmless, but, you know, it was the Pentagon who was working with the Ukrainian government on these. I'm just curious what your thought is on these biolabs and the fact that, again, the Pentagon was working with them. Do you think that these could have been working on biological weapons, or do you think that this was, you know, kind of mundane biological research?
The official word that I got when I inquired about it was that they represent the World Health Organization, the conglomerate known usually as the EU equivalent, and a number of other organizations, including China. And Wuhan, the lab of question with regard to COVID-19, is the same way, basically, where international scientists with medical bent work on trying to develop methods and techniques and even vaccines and so forth to deal with things like Ebola Zaire, Ebola Reston, the disease breakouts of very lethal filoviruses in Africa. And Reston, of course, was in Reston, Virginia, with 88% lethality back in 89, 90. And come up with ways to deal with them. That's the official word on these labs. The question there is indisputable. Couldn't believe the New York Times ran a line that said baseless charges. That
well, that's another, you know, shameful thing that the media does is they immediately dismiss anything as a baseless conspiracy theory with no evidence before hearing any evidence whatsoever. But is it typical for the? Sorry,
I really can't say what might be going on there in a.
Well, is it typical for the Pentagon to be working on biolabs that would not be weaponized?
You know, that's a hard question to answer. When we went to the crisis mode with regard to Reston, by the way, most of America knows nothing about this. Fort Detrick was very involved. And Fort Detrick, of course, is really close by. And I got a telescopic view into Fort Detrick from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's office. And in particular, I got a view into their Biolevel 4 facility, where a lieutenant colonel, for example, brave woman, was actually working on this filovirus, trying to figure it out, and her spacesuit ripped. Because that's what gives you the Biolevel 4. You're in this facility, but you've also got a spacesuit on.
Right.
And her suit ripped, and they said, you need to come out. You need to come out immediately. So this thing killed you within 48 hours and with 88% lethality. And she didn't. She chose to stay in there and work. And subsequently, in a very private, secret ceremony, she was awarded a medal, as well she should have been. But it didn't kill her. The other 3 levels protected her. But this is a very, very deadly sort of process that the military is involved in. And one wonders sometimes if someone doesn't walk into the room and say, wow, that's really neat. I believe I'd like to weaponize that. Now, of course, we won't put it anywhere but on the shelf, just in case, but let's weaponize it. I can't believe that somebody, I've been in the military too long, I can't believe that somebody hasn't made that statement or had that thought, and even perhaps put money to it and put development to it.
And then this also ties into the U.S. In response to this, saying that Russia may launch a false flag attack in response to this, or to try to pin these biolabs on the U.S. Again, the logic to me isn't that clear, but what can you say about, does Russia have an official biological or chemical weapons programs? Because I believe that these are banned by international law, right?
We're happy to welcome you in the Embassy of Russia at the reception on the occasion of the completion of the National Chemical Weapons Destruction Program in the Russian Federation. This event is a milestone for us our country has successfully fulfilled its main international commitment in accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention and completely eliminated its chemical arsenal, which used to be the largest in the world. It means about 48,000 tons of deadly chemicals inherited from the past. Throughout the existence of the program, really huge and large-scale work has been done. 7 advanced technology-intensive enterprises were constructed in various regions of our country. Unique domestic technologies were developed. It will not be an exaggeration to say that a separate industry was created, which was meant only for the purpose of the elimination of the chemical arsenal.
I want to present to Minister Kalamanov a memorable certificate, and I'm going to read it in English. It's both in English and Russian. This is to certify that in accordance with the provisions of Article 4 of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and Use of Chemical Weapons and on their destruction, and Part 4A of the verification annex to the Convention, on 27 September 2017, the Russian Federation completed the destruction of its chemical weapons previously declared pursuant to Article 3 of the Convention. The inspection teams of the Technical Secretariat have verified the destruction at 7 chemical weapons destruction facilities in the Russian Federation of the following quantities of declared chemical agents. And the sites were in fact mentioned here and signed by myself. Congratulations.
We had a lot of conventions that we passed for things like biological and chemical weapons, landmines, cluster bombs, and so forth. But if you've studied the history of warfare, particularly over modern warfare over the last 20, 30 years, lots of violations have gone on. And we've been guilty of some of them. For example, the depleted uranium rounds we used in Iraq. It's clear now that they cause cancer. It's clear that
white phosphorus, I believe, also in Fallujah, correct?
Yes, yes. So you can say they're banned, and I will say that our military probably adheres to those bans as well as anyone, if not better. Usually because it's not really utilitarian to use them. You injure your own people as badly as you do the enemy. But you take a regime like Syria or a regime like Russia, I think now, they probably wouldn't hesitate to use such weapons. And that they have them, I find it very difficult to believe they don't.
But I mean, what would the utility be, especially in this circumstance where
to blame others? Yeah, to blame others. To you, as Assad did in Syria. Now, I still don't know to this day. You may know that I've been one of the ones that contested the OPCW when they declared that.
Right. Well, there was a whistleblower as well who contested that.
Yeah. So it's pretty easy to disguise it. You can put it somewhere, let it affect some people, and then claim it with someone else, whether you're a terrorist or whether you're a state.
But just the logic from Russia's point of view, it seems as though that would be inviting NATO to get involved in the war, which I don't know if that necessarily makes sense.
I tend to agree with you. I think there's a certain deterrent nature to these weapons, and I think it would be a last resort. But what worries me is that I think what we're doing now, we, the United States, but with NATO's complicity, we are trying to use Ukraine and Ukrainians to wear down Russia, to make Russia at the end incapable of doing anything like this again, and maybe even incapable of running its gas empire. I think that's part of our motivation here. And I think we see Ukraine as a delicious experiment in doing this. And so we're going to try to stretch it out and try to bleed him as much as we can. And one of the things Sun Tzu and Clausewitz says, which I think is very smart, never paint a powerful enemy into a corner from whence he cannot escape.
again, I'd really be interested in how you would evaluate what's happening in Ukraine. And again, I know it's hard with the way that the media is being censored, and RT and Sputnik are being deplatformed across the West and whatnot. But just I think that again, the story has been a little incoherent insofar as we're being told on the one hand, Russia is overrunning Ukraine, they're a threat to all these other countries on their border. At the same time, we're being told that their equipment is not working well. There was a report that just came out that said 60% of the missiles that they fired were faulty. The Ukrainians are fighting back. The Russian tires on their vehicles were giving out. So again, it seems a little incoherent to me. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Is Russia winning this war? Are they doing it less successfully than they thought they would? Or just how would you evaluate what's been happening?
It's mixed, but you have to consider that the Russians, as I said before, are being somewhat circumspect. They are not going whole hog with their armored columns. They're not going through the fields where grain is growing. They're not, I'll give you an example. In Mariupol, of some fame in the US media, the Russian regimental commander carved out a corridor through which the citizens could leave. The neo-Nazi in charge of the only element inside the city that had weapons told the mayor and the civilians he'd shoot them if they left. So frustrated the Russian commander's attempt not to kill too many civilians. So they've been very careful about, I know they've killed civilians. This is hypocritical too. We killed lots of civilians in Iraq and lots of civilians in Afghanistan. No one seems to remember that. But they have not killed a lot considering their power and their combat power in particular. They are having problems. There's no question about that.
Well, the reports I've been seeing are saying that it seems as though Russia has lost more soldiers than Ukrainian civilians have been killed.
I think what I've seen that I trust, it's roughly equivalent, equipment-wise, people-wise, and it's worse for Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't have quite as much that the Russians have. Now, if we keep pouring stuff in there, and NATO keeps pouring stuff in there, then that offsets that. And that leads me to what I said before. We are going to milk this to try and destroy Putin and Russia. That's what it looks like right now.
Much like Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s.
Yes, only worse because this is a very, very overextension by Russia, if you will, from what it normally, it doesn't do logistics well. And you're seeing that. They've never done logistics well. Joe Stalin in World War II put all of his forces up against the best in the world, the Wehrmacht, over 100 Wehrmacht divisions, and he beat them sheerly by 2 million Russian deaths. I mean, that's how many people he lost. The Germans were just ripping him up, but he had more people than they did. There's no talent, no skill to that. But it essentially got him to Berlin, got Stalin's troops to Berlin because they were just relentless and they were willing to die by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. So you've got to see that kind of history of the Russian military to understand how the media is presenting it improperly. Russia is very deep and very strong and very powerful and always will be and always has been. You can come to 1917, you can come to World War I, around that, and you can say, well, there are weak spots. Yeah, of course there are. There are weak spots in every state's history. But basically, it's like Bismarck said, the first thing you do if you want to survive in Central Europe is make a treaty with Russia. They are a powerful country.
So again, I just would be interested, and I hate to ask you to predict what's going to happen, but I'd be interested in your thoughts again on how things have been unfolding. It seems as though Russia has really encircled the center of Ukraine. Do you think that this is just a war of attrition at this point? Or are they just trying to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table?
I think their original purpose, strategic purpose, was to ensure their access to the entire rim of the Black Sea, from Sevastopol to Odessa, and to attrit the Ukrainian military to the point where one could say, well, they're no longer a threat, and they're not a threat to ethnic Russians inside Ukraine or to Russia proper. I think it's going to transmogrify, though, because of what we're doing. I think we're putting up, through the Ukrainians, are putting up a steel wall, if you will, that is so formidable that the Russians can cross it, but at enormous cost in men, material, and reputation in the world. They're becoming a pariah, if not already. And that's dangerous. That's extremely dangerous, what I was saying before. So when I predict what would happen, I have to say, I wish what would happen is we'd get some good diplomats and go talk, and we'd be willing to give more than we get. And what do I mean by that? We'd recognize his sovereignty over Crimea. Maybe we'd say, okay, you recognize Kosovo. You recognize Kosovo, and we'll recognize your sovereignty over Crimea. We will promise not to go any further with NATO, and we won't put Ukraine in NATO. And we'll promise that we won't be stirring up Ukraine, especially the hard right groups in Ukraine, in the future. Do we have the exquisite capability diplomatically and the intent, more than that, to do that sort of thing? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, it begs the question, why have we not been doing that? You know, why were we expanding NATO? Why were we funding Nazis in Ukraine?
Exactly. I think there are people in the Congress and in the government who want to attrit Russia to the point where she's no longer a threat to anyone, and that is just idiotic. And second, there are people who want to make a fortune off this war. Here's what should happen. It's time for this. We should have a new accord in Helsinki, in Paris, someplace, and we should establish 3 fundamentals that we're working towards. 1, Washington gives up its desire to have hegemony over Western Europe. 2, Moscow gives up its desire to reestablish Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe. And 3, Europe, now 740 million strong, with 140 million Russians in it, stands up, becomes economically, politically, and financially sound, and becomes the 3rd center in the world, China, Europe, America, and everybody works on the climate crisis. And at the same time works on nuclear arms control agreements.
Right.
But the Europeans need their own security architecture. We need to get out of Europe.
Nuclear weapons, obviously, you know, that is the worst case scenario that is on everyone's minds, is what if this escalates into a nuclear war? So again, I'm just wondering, as somebody who was in the Army for years, what do you think the likelihood of that is, and what would be the scenario by which, you know, that could happen?
I think the likelihood is low until you make Putin desperate. And what I was just saying, that we're trying to bleed him dry and bleed Russia dry as much as we possibly can, is the kind of way you make him desperate. And to say, if you're Sullivan or Blinken or Lloyd Austin, that you can judge that moment, that you're going past that so that he doesn't respond with something like a small yield nuclear weapon, is just nonsense, because you can't. You can't get in someone's head that way and say, now I know he's going to shoot tomorrow, so I'm going to quit. And that's what worries me. That worries me, because there's no path right now open up that I can see whereby we can talk about this and get it stopped.
Do you think it's plausible for the United States and Russia to have a conventional war against each other, like in Ukraine, like a shooting war between either armies or air forces, without that escalating into global exchange of ICBMs?
Russian doctrine says it will escalate to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's their published doctrine, because they fear our advantage in precision-guided munitions, which they saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, so much. They don't have that kind of capability. We're seeing it in Ukraine, that they would strike with nuclear weapons. That's what they say in their published doctrine.
Even if there was a launch of conventional nuclear weapons,
no such thing.
Would it? Well, would it be possible for that to be even that to be isolated without that escalating into, again, an exchange of ICBMs?
All of our research throughout the Cold War indicated that escalation theory, such as it was, meant that if you started it, you would be on a ladder you could not dismount from. You would wind up with a general exchange of nuclear weapons. Every war game I ever participated in, and there are hundreds, Taiwan, the Fulda Gap in Europe, Hokkaido Island on Japan, global war with the Soviets, and so forth. Every war game I ever participated in, when nuclear weapons were used, it went all the way. Usually the civilian leaders of the war games would stop the game because they didn't want, in Taiwan, we would fight. We would attrit the Air Force and the Navy. They would attrit our Air Force and our Navy. And we'd be looking at each other because we weren't about to invade China. And China didn't have the power projection capability to come here or to go very far out to hunt for us, and didn't want to anyway because their Navy had been damaged so badly. So what did we do in the games? We had a general or an admiral who would say, let's hit Shanghai and Hainan Island with a couple of nukes, and that'll cause them to quit. And then the red team would say, okay, we heard what you said. You're going to hit Hainan and Shanghai with a couple of tactical nuclear weapons. We're going to hit Los Angeles, New York. That's the way it works. When in 2002, Pakistan and India were about to go to war with one another, we dispatched Colin Powell, Rich Armitage, and a host of other people to Delhi and Islamabad. And we found out that they thought that if they shot 10, the other side would shoot 10. And if they shot 10 from the other side, then they would shoot 20, and then it would probably stop and somebody would win. They did not have permissive action locks on their weapons, which keep just anybody from shooting a nuclear weapon. They did not have escalatory theory. They hadn't thought about it. That's how rudimentary Pakistan and India were. Think about that for a minute. That's somewhat scary because they've got stockpiles that are big enough. If they had a general exchange, they would affect agriculture in California, Colorado, Kansas. The nuclear winter that would follow after just an exchange between Pakistan and India would probably be 5 years of no agriculture that was really possible.
Do you think that there are people in the US military who believe that we could win a nuclear war against Russia?
There weren't. For 30 plus years, there weren't. I think there are some who've come back now.
So again, just if there was to be a full-scale exchange, could you describe what that would look like? What would happen to the United States?
We would cease to exist, especially if it were our stockpiles that were expended. We had about 30,000 each at the end of the Cold War. And with us destroying Russia's and our own, we got down to somewhere around 8,000 or 9,000 now. But that's still enough. And the caliber of some of these weapons, 100, 1,000 times more powerful than those that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example. These weapons are incredible. It'd just be, if it was escalatory, it would be a disaster. We'd pretty much beat the climate change to eliminating the human race. That's how bad it is. Dan Ellsberg will tell you all about it, and no one knows it probably better than Dan because he was the man responsible for doing all this before he, leaked the Pentagon papers and got his conscience bothered by what happened in Vietnam.
So, I mean, just again, thinking that our leaders are, somewhat rational, obviously, they're probably going to stop short of that and avoid it. As we've seen the Biden administration, seemingly saying we're not having a no-fly zone, we're not committing troops. So, I mean, where do you think the red lines are, before we start escalating towards that? Is it Russia invading a NATO country? Like if they invaded Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, could that escalate into a nuclear war?
It could, because Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all. If you really want to get down to the base tax, we now have pushed out to 29 other countries that guarantee, and that guarantee ultimately is our nuclear umbrella. So take Montenegro, for example. Texas rancher would tell you, where is Montenegro? I don't know where that is. Show it to me. And you tell him, well, you're risking nuclear war for Montenegro. So we shouldn't have let some of these countries in NATO simply because they couldn't pass the anti-corruption procedures that they were supposed to go through.
Well, again, you could probably apply that to Ukraine.
You could. But your question is a good one because, these people, most Americans don't, 90%, I would guess, or more of Americans don't understand we're guaranteeing we will put our nuclear umbrella over Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Montenegro, and we were going to do it over Ukraine and Georgia.
Well, again, and I think that there's not really an understanding of what World War III versus Russia means. It seems as though a lot of people think that it would be like World War II and would be a conventional war without understanding that it could escalate into the destruction of every city on Earth.
It could. And that's what's been forgotten. In 1989, Colin Powell had just taken over the forces command, and I just joined him. And he looked at me one day in his office early on. I was just a lieutenant colonel at the time, so I'm just listening to him. I wasn't talking much. And he said, you know, Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl and Maggie Thatcher and John Major and all the leaders in Europe whose feet are in World War II are going to be gone soon. And that's when everything's going to change, because no one's going to remember the war. No one's going to remember the Cold War, and we're going to be in trouble. Those were very prophetic words.
Well, Colonel Wilkerson, I did have some patron questions for you. I know we only have about 15 minutes before you have to hop off, so I'm going to try to get through these quickly. The first one says, why do you think Congress in 2016 dropped a rider from a bill that would have forbidden arms to Ukrainian Nazis? Was it due to pressure from the Pentagon? Were there other factors?
I think the members of the Congress with whom I've spoken, both in the Senate and the House, believe that any enemy, like any port in a storm, any enemy that was opposing Russia is a good one. They didn't care that they were neo-Nazis. We're doing the same thing in Yemen. We're supporting the most brutal war on the face of the earth in Yemen. By the way, we seem to have forgotten that in the media. And we're doing it with a brutal dictator, Mohammed bin Salman, in Riyadh. And the Senate and the House are letting it go on.
So next question, what lever of powers exists to compel NATO de-escalation in Ukraine? This feels like Dr. Strangelove, which did not end well.
Thank you. That's a good characterization of it. And I don't know the level of power. I don't think there is one. There's only the sanity of a president and the sanity of several prime ministers and presidents in Europe.
Next question says, is there any possibility of U.S. leadership to de-escalate and actually provide rational leadership? Is there a possibility that they can show Russia and China the respect they deserve? This feels like white supremacy being played out on a global scale.
Another good comment and question. It is. And meanwhile, our good ally Israel continues to prosecute the Palestinians like we did the American Indians from 1866 to 1890 and settle in there. So all this stuff is going on that should be stopped. We have bigger priorities, the climate crisis, nuclear weapons, but I don't know. I don't see the leadership. I was hoping Biden would be smart enough and deft enough, because domestic politics is murderous in this country now. The moment he shows any ankle at all on this, any kind of weakness at all on this, the Republicans will eat his lunch. So it's extremely difficult for him to even take sane action because of that.
So the next question, I think this may have actually been submitted prior to the news of the U.S. and EU signing that agreement for the natural gas, but it says, it seems that part of the reason for the U.S. escalation strategy in Ukraine is trying to sell their shale gas, which is apparently more expensive and more polluting than Russia's natural gas, to Europe by stopping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Could you comment on this? Does this make sense?
Well, the counter to that, of course, is my own company here in Virginia, the second largest public utility on the East Coast after Duke Power, and I'm talking about Virginia Dominion Energy, was building the East Coast pipeline, $12–13 billion worth, huge investment for Dominion. And all of a sudden, the Trump and Biden administrations in combination canceled it, ostensibly based on two things. One, the Congress said, no, it would sell all of its product to Europe. So we don't want to do that. It's got to sell its product to the US customer, and it's not planning on doing that. So we're going to cancel it. And environmental concerns, because of the pipes that were having to be created and going through West Virginia and so forth. That's sort of counterintuitive, but I will say this. I think the representative for Russia and the representative for Ukraine to the intergovernmental panel on climate crisis, 28 February, they published a report. The Russian head and the Ukrainian head both said something to the effect of, this is really insane that we're fighting here fundamentally over fossil fuels, and they knew what they were talking about. And those are the things that are going to kill us all. So they're both right. And that Russian head of delegation also condemned the invasion. So brave man he. I hope he's still alive.
So the next question is from John McCarthy in Chicago. John writes, presidential hopeful Ro Khanna has been demanding that leftists denounce Putin as a war criminal, while at the same time tweeting praise for war criminal Hillary Clinton. Do you find any comments, do you find any of his comments hypocritical? Hillary's wars have certainly killed many more civilians than Putin's wars.
I don't find that an untrue statement. And as a matter of fact, the woman who just died, Madeleine Albright, I'd put a lot of the problems that we're having right now in Europe at her feet.
Yeah, I mean, it was odd timing with, Madeleine Albright's passing. I don't know, did you see the images from Serbia where they were, because it was actually the anniversary of the bombing of Belgrade, and they were commemorating the anniversary, and also people were holding up signs saying "Burn in Hell, Madeleine Albright." I don't know if you saw those images.
Frankly, if had I been in their shoes, I'm sure I probably would have said the same thing. Clinton said 3 days of bombing and it'll all be over. 78 days later of constant bombing, when Wes Clark, the general who got fired for it, actually began to move ground troops toward the conflict, Milosevic finally saw the handwriting on the wall and caved in. But it wasn't the bombing. That just killed civilians and destroyed property.
So the next question is, if Zelensky and Putin were to come to an agreement, would the U.S. accept it?
That is a very good question. One I asked myself about a week ago, and I said no at the time, but now I'm thinking it would be so public, it could be made so public anyway, that they'd have a hard time doing that. So I like to think maybe it would be impossible.
Do you think that Zelensky, I'm sorry, this is my question. Do you think that Zelensky is really, in charge of what is happening in Ukraine? Because again, just the fact that to a large degree, it seems as though Ukraine was kind of set up 8 years ago as a puppet regime. This guy is an actor. He's seemingly doing some videos in front of green screens. Like, do you think that he's actually in charge of Ukraine's government and military forces?
I don't think anyone would have the talent for complexity and corruption, an emphasis on that latter word, to be that sort of person in Ukraine. I just don't. I think he's probably doing the best he can given the hand he's been dealt and what the United States and NATO are putting pressure on him to do. But I don't hold out hope that he'll be some kind of savior at the end of the day. Either way, a savior of Ukraine through armed might or a savior through diplomacy. I think he could be a pressure on those who could be that would be good, but I don't know if he will.
So next question says to ask you about the nuclear and other programs that were being dismantled in Ukraine when the Soviet Union dissolved and Ukraine became independent. So could you speak to, again, Ukraine's nuclear arsenal at the end of the Cold War and their disarmament?
Yeah, I certainly can. One of the funny things about our press talking initially about Zelensky's comments or someone's comments, maybe it was more than Zelensky, they shouldn't have given up their weapons. It was just our press didn't understand it. Those weapons were never Ukrainian weapons. They were Russian weapons, Moscow controlled on Ukrainian soil. And so it wouldn't have done the Ukrainians a bit of good to have kept them unless they were going to disassemble them and get the nuclear material out of them. And that would have been quite dangerous, probably. So
the Russian military, the Soviet/Russian military never gave up control of those nuclear weapons.
No, Moscow never gave up control. The Kremlin ran their system not too differently than ours. We've always had, and they've always had, civilian control of nuclear weapons. They do not give operational command or operational control to field commanders over nuclear weapons. Now, the one exception I know about that, and I can't prove it because the archives aren't clear enough, but we didn't think there were any active nuclear weapons in Cuba in October 1962. There were. There were 10 free overground rockets, called them frogs in NATO parlance, just outside Guantanamo in a Soviet battery with roughly operational command given to the Soviet commander in Cuba. And their mission was to shoot a US invasion fleet and destroy it. So had we mounted a military operation, that was their mission, to shoot that fleet. Now, a couple of nuclear weapons will take wipe those ships right off the surface of the ocean. So that's very dangerous. And that's the only occasion I know of where that has happened. So it's civilians who keep control over the codes, the permissive action locks, and the other security paraphernalia associated with nuclear weapons.
So again, just going back to these biolabs, as I understand it, these were Soviet era biological research facilities that went into the hands of the Ukrainian government, and then that's when the Pentagon was working with Ukraine on them. So those were not under Moscow's direct control. Those are different than nuclear weapons.
Now that you asked me a question there, I can't answer. I would take a guess and say that because of and we forget this too, the affinity of Ukraine in general to Moscow during the communist period. And, I have to admit that affinity was mostly caused by the fact that communists were in control in Kyiv, just like they were in Warsaw and Prague and everywhere else. But you didn't see this kind of division. It was part of the Soviet Union, just as was Moldova and Belarusia, I say, they call it Belarus, and the other Soviet socialist republics that were part of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't some pressure. Stalin moved populations around and whole populations around just to relieve that pressure. It didn't do much good because now it's back again. But there was this affinity between Ukraine and a feeling that they were a part of the Soviet Union that isn't there today, because that, like the former Yugoslavia, Tito's gone and that pressure's all let loose, like a pressure cooker exploding. So you have all kinds of people feeling different ways in Ukraine now. And the difference between then and now is then they couldn't say it because the communist apparatus would smack them down or imprison them quickly. Now they can say it and they can get away with it to an extent. And so now you have all these pressures flowing all over the place.
So just two quick last questions. Just going back to the Clintons, somebody wants to know, how much influence do the Clintons have in this conflict?
I hope none, but you can't say that people who have the money they do don't have influence. You look at the Gateses and the Bezoses and the Musk. The Guardian had an interesting article the other day, and I think they're spot on right. They claimed, and they had some proof of it in the article, that the oligarchs of the world, Washington, Berlin, Paris, London, Moscow, China, they were also linked through the banks and everything, that the sanctions that would be most critical, most damaging on them would never be enforced. I think they're right.
So the very last question, in an interview with Paul Jay and Philip Bennis in April 2021, you expressed the importance of remaining in Afghanistan, that it is strategically foolish to leave. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, my appreciation of it was strictly a strategic one. It had nothing to do with Afghanistan as Afghanistan. And there were three reasons really why I said that. One, we wanted to stay abreast of China's Base Road Initiative as it runs from China through Central Asia and into Europe. By the way, China has $3+ billion US investment in Ukraine to make it an entrepot for the end product of that BRI line. So they're not too happy about what's happening right now, despite what the media says. The second reason was staying so we could pounce on Pakistan's nuclear stockpile if we had to, because it is probably the most dangerous, unstable nuclear stockpile in the world. And we'd have hard military power right there. And the third reason was, if we ever went to war with China, which God forbid I do not hope for, but if we did, we'd want to have some forces on that flank of China that we could get into Xinjiang province, where most of the Uyghurs live, and use those 15 million or so Uyghurs as part of our effort to destabilize China. It had nothing to do with Afghanistan.
Well, Colonel, I really do appreciate you being on the show today and going over all these topics. I wish that we had more time. I hope that I can have you back on in the future. For folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with you, or if you have any other projects that they can know about, how can they learn about that?
Oh, William & Mary's website has my email on it. It's lbwilk@wm.edu.
Well, thank you again, Colonel. I really do appreciate your time. And again, I do hope I can have you back at some point in the future.
Surely. Thank you.